Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back for another episode. This is Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for subscribing, and thank you for referring others. Today is a guest day, as our ongoing listeners know. From time to time, I will just share my ideas and insights, talk about articles I've stumbled across, things related to professional relationships and business networking. And then from time to time, I'll have a guest on it. Today, I have a guest. What I want to preface, before I introduce our guest, I want to preface this all to, I want to tie this all into our guest. If you've listened long enough, and we're 170 some episodes into this, if you've listened long enough, you know that I'm not one to entirely look at networking as just tactic and strategies, handshakes and smiles and things like that. Those are important, but with respect to relationships, obviously you can't have a relationship just with yourself. I guess you can, but that's a whole nother conversation. But relationships involve other people. And so for us to really effectively understand professional relationships or personal relationships, they're one and the same in my mind. For us to really understand those things, we need to talk with people who really kind of explore these things on an ongoing basis. So I have with me today Richard Boyatzis. Did I get that right, Richard?
Yes, you did. Thank you, Frank.
That'll be the last time I'll say it. You're Richard henceforth. But Richard is a distinguished university professor at Case Western University and also an adjunct professor at the International ISADA Business School. And in our talk before we hit record, he is the author of 8 books, 4 of which are relevant to really the topic here. One is Primal Leadership, Resident Leadership, and Become a Resident Leader. And those all have been published through the Harvard Business Review Press. In addition, he co-authored a book with 3 of his colleagues from Case Western. And the title of the book is Helping People Change, Coaching with Compassion for Lifelong Learning and Growth. So I'm very happy to have you on the program today. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Now, in paging through the book, again, it's relationships, and the theme you guys bring out right from the beginning is so often when we see people with, we'll call them shortcomings, gaps is a term you use as well. We try and fix those things, and what your research and insight shows is that really what you need to do is help try and connect these people to their vision for themselves and or an inspiring dream or goal that they might have. How did this all come about? I guess kind of give your backstory.
Sure. I was really good in math and physics. And even though the public school in New York City tried to lead me back because I thought I was cognitively slow, it had to do with speaking Greek before I spoke English and all that. But I eventually got tested in a place where they recognized what I could do. And the next thing I know, I was in my first choice school at MIT. I got a degree in aeronautics and astronautics. I was specializing in designing interplanetary vehicles. That was in the mid-'60s. I ran out of money. I was putting myself through school. My father and mother were immigrants from Greece, and my father was a waiter and couldn't really help me much. And I had used up all the money I'd made with bands and working jobs. And MIT got me a job doing that kind of research for a company out in California, in LA, called Northrop Grumman. And during the 6.5 months I was working there as a research scientist, I discovered that I really couldn't stand the day-to-day work. It was boring. So somewhat puzzled, I went back and finished my degree because I only had a few courses left. But I also said, okay, I've got to do something. I don't want to go back in the restaurant business. I'm not good enough to be, although I paid for part of my MIT schooling through my music. I wasn't good enough to go pro full time. So I said, okay, I'll go into management. It's got to be easy. Look at these idiots we had out in this research entity. So I took some management courses, and in the process discovered this field called psychology, which my father, even for 3 years after I finished my PhD at Harvard in psychology, by then they had moved up from New York City to up to Boston where I was, and they were, my mother and father, very active in the Greek Orthodox Church in Brockton, Mass. My father would, right up until he died in 1975, introduce me as his son who got a degree in engineering from MIT. He left off the PhD because it was in psychology, which the Greek word is sakramatis, which is foolishness. And secondly, he thought, he came as good immigrant stock, that people who went to MIT were good, healthy people studying important, real things. Whereas people who went to Harvard, he saw in that day, Harvard as a den of leftist pinko thought. Of course, we know how much it's changed since. But at any rate, I ended up having to put myself through graduate school also. So I ended up starting in 1969 consulting and doing training work. And because of the research I started in 1967 and then continued in my PhD program, I ended up getting a whole bunch of contracts with companies like Monsanto, nonprofits like the American Baptists, as well as private schools and other entities. But I also got to work at the Brockton VA as a clinical psychologist. I developed a new therapy program. So I spent a lot of the 70s doing competency research, what accounts for people who are more effective managers and leaders, as well as doing therapy programs, training therapists, and doing basic research on it. That morphed at the end of the decade, and by the time I was into it for about a year and a half, I all of a sudden became the CEO of the company. And at that point, we had, about 12 people. And by the time I finished 11 years later, we had a few hundred. I've built a few businesses over the years, and I love entrepreneurial activities. I've spent a lot of time also studying family businesses. And it's pretty clear that if you're running a business, especially a more entrepreneurial, or you started something, maybe your first generation, maybe second, that although in the very early days, the person who was the founder did everything. You wrote the marketing copy, you ran to the bank to deposit any receipts so you could make payroll, and you did it all. As soon as you got above a certain size, which very often was somewhere between 30 and 50 people, you didn't have time for that. Or if you did, you weren't paying attention to your customers or your market. So by the time you start to build some stability, you realize you can't do it all anymore.
Right.
So all of a sudden, you have to start depending on other people. And as a company grows, as it passes 150 to 250 people, before long, you start to realize that you're managing and leading people who are managing and leading people who are managing and leading people who actually do the work. So now the question is, how do you keep people motivated?
Right.
And anybody that pays attention at all knows that money is not an issue. If people wanted to maximize their money, they'd go into real estate, period. We also know, and I've known it because I've worked with folks, that as soon as you get a certain amount of money, you always want more. Right. I mean, I worked with commodity oil day traders in a very large company once, doing some competency work and some workshops, and these are guys who made 10 to 20 to 30 million a year in their bonuses. And after the second year, it wasn't motivating anymore, because they just used it as kind of a scorecard. So why do people work? Because you want to add value. You want to make a difference. You want to see something grow. You want new products and services. You want to innovate, or you want to satisfy a customer or social need. And in the process, you want to build something that has some survivability, which always requires adaptation, which means that people aren't doing the same thing over and over again. So we now have plenty of data to say there is a worldwide motivational crisis. People, I think the last survey I saw, 76% of the people with full-time jobs in the US aren't engaged in their work. 83% in Europe, 81% in Japan. These are people with full-time jobs.
Wow.
That says that 4 out of every 5 people coming to work, their body's showing up, but not all of them. And in small businesses, you're very sensitive to the activities of every person. All it takes is one person to cut back on their energy 10, 20%, or 3 people to, and you're having a slump. So the challenge of how do you motivate people? How do you motivate them in particular to learn, to adapt, to be open to new ideas is very, very difficult, because it turns out, and we've learned this from the research, that a lot of the ways we go about trying to manage and motivate people do the opposite. I started the very first study on this issue of how do people effectively help others or not in their 30s back in 1967. Ended up being my first published empirical study. Spent a lot of time, as I said, practicing this. But 35 years ago, when I started as a full-time professor, I left the world of running consulting companies. It became pretty clear that how we coach or help, in a large sense, other people around us became crucial. So we started a series of studies at Case Western Reserve University. We now have 39 published academic studies, as well as 3 fMRI studies, functional neuroimaging studies, and 2 hormonal studies. All but 2 of those neuroimaging studies have been done with folks in the 30s, 40s, or 50s who are working. And what all of these studies have done is helped us to understand that if we want to help people be open to learn and change and be motivated, we can't be what I would call a managerial bully. So the typical way people go about trying to help someone is to give them tips. You know, when what people think a mentor or a coach is somebody who tells you what to do. We now have very clear data that when somebody is the recipient of advice, they close down. It activates a network in their brain that forces them into closing down their openness, and they go into defensive mode.
Wow,
and
interesting.
And just because the people are subordinates doesn't mean, you know, even in leadership relationships, just because somebody is your subordinate doesn't mean they're a follower of yours. You know, because as I used to say, sometimes people spit in the coffee when they're bringing it to you. So the question ends up being, are people jazzed? Are they juiced about what they're doing? And that's where what we've discovered over these 30, 35 years is that from the research and then also doing it in a lot of organizations, for-profit, not-for-profit, even the military, that when you try to help someone, and we took the expression coaching with compassion, because what we're saying is you're trying to focus on them, not you. So you want to know what's their dream in life, not their goals, bigger than that, their deeper sense of purpose, and build a quality relationship. You then have a shot at it, at stimulating the parts of the brain and their body that allow them to be open, that result in these. We've measured people out 7 years, that to the degree they can sustain a change. So what we've been doing is saying most of the time when people try to quote unquote help someone else, they're actually doing what we call coaching for compliance. I want you to act the way I'm telling you. Why? Because I'm your in-laws and I know you should dress your kids. You know, I've been through this. I founded the company. I'm telling you, this is the way to do it. All of that stuff is experienced by the recipient as bullying, and you close down. So what we're saying is a little counterintuitive, because it even comes down to goals. It turns out that goals are useful in a change process, but only much later. In the early stages, the first few months, first year of a change or learning process, goals actually close a person to new ideas. And what happens is people get into this group think that, hey, that's not the way we do it here. That's, you know, we didn't invent it here. And what they end up doing is not watching their competition take away their markets or their technology. So we've been very excited. It's the research is really sound. We've published at a lot of academic places. We give talks on this stuff all over the world. And yet it's very practical because people come out of our 1 and 2 hour talks, if not our workshops, with techniques they can apply the next day. But it's not easy. I mean, one of the things I like to point out to people is the reason most people don't change. I mean, the learning impact from education is abysmal, what sticks. And the same thing from training. And yet, usually in surveys, the last one I saw of 1,800 MBA graduates 2 years after, so these would be folks around 32, 33 in Europe, as to why they chose the company they were working for and to stay there. Money, comp and benefits, and salary was the 7th reason. The first 6 had to do with novelty, change, learning, growth, development. People want something exciting. And that comes when they feel like what they're serving is an important purpose. And they feel like the people around them are all together in this game.
That's interesting. I've often theorized that if somebody gave me $1 million to dig a ditch, I wouldn't be happy for long. Because to your point, I'm not creating value.
No, and I think that if you've been digging ditches, for 10 years, well, like you've been doing these podcasts for a while now, you've been doing certain consulting. If somebody came along and said, Frank, you've got this problem, and I could help you be so much more effective if you change this way. Now, if you hadn't asked that person, if they just came along and told you,
right,
you might say, well, maybe I should look at that. But the research tells us that any effort you might put into it would last about 2 to 3 weeks and then stop. It's why people who try to lose weight can't. It's a negatively framed goal. You go on a diet, a week or 2 later, you're off for some reason. I found the same thing with alcoholics and drug addicts. We found the same thing in with physicians and nurses around treatment adherence. I mean, it's abysmal how little people do what their physicians or nurses tell them to do when they come out of surgery. Really, it's called treatment adherence. How much of what the doctor or the physician or the nurse tells you are you actually doing? Treatment adherence after coronary bypass surgery is about 20%.
Wow.
So I think the reason is, that's why I spend so much time giving talks in various hospitals and hospital systems, as well as doing research in these areas, is it's because most physicians try to tell you from their expertise what you should do. And they try to scare the hell out of you, and it doesn't work. Or it doesn't work for very long. It's not sustainable.
Right. So what is the secret sauce? What should these doctors do? What should managers do? What should people who are really having relationships with anybody?
Right. Well, the first is the theme of your entire programmatic effort, is you want to build good relationships. And good relationships means people feel you're in sync with them. You're in tune with them. Hierarchy has never worked as of a form of leadership. I mean, the research since and during World War II showed that it doesn't work. I've worked with, hundreds of thousands of military officers and senior enlisted, and even with SEAL teams and Delta Force. Believe me, command and control is not what works in the military. That's ineffective leadership. In their words, the effective leaders say it's ask and inspire. And this comes out of the Navy and Marine Corps primarily. So one of the things that you start to realize is that once you bring somebody into your organization, assuming you can convince them to come to work for you, and this would include your children and family members, by the way, you have to somehow build a good relationship with them in which they feel, and there's some mutuality of an exchange of shared purpose. So there's hope about what we're doing in this organization. No organization exists to make money. They exist for some other purpose. Money is how we keep track, but it's not the purpose. People want to know what the purpose is because, among other things, it gives them hope. That's what we call vision or shared vision. People want to feel trusted and respected, and they'll trust and respect back. People want to feel like the person they're dealing with is authentic or genuine, not a phony. So you have a lot of these characteristics of a really good, what we call a resonant relationship, where you're in tune with each other. And you notice it if you've ever been on a sports team that really did well, or a product development team, or played in a band, that when people are working together well, nobody has to say something explicitly. Every time somebody moves, everybody else adjusts. So I would say the first thing is you realize that you aren't hiring human resources. You aren't hiring chairs or desks. You're hiring people. And even though the people are there to do a job, and you're going to hopefully pay them well and create incentives, that only covers a small amount of it. They're people, and you want to build a relationship that will be, in a sense, the glue that makes it all work. The second thing is that I think it's the responsibility of every leader or manager to know the dreams, the personal vision of the people who report to them, even if that vision means they don't want to be working in that organization. Because if you know their dreams, and by the way, we think the easiest way to get that is if you have a trusting relationship. If you don't have a trusting relationship, they're not going to give you an honest answer to this. But the actual question is, if your life were fantastic 10 to 15 years from now, absolutely ideal, what would it be like? And we always start 10 to 15 years out. We always start with life, because work is a subset, and it all backs into it. And when a person develops this vision, that one of the things you can do as a manager, as a boss, as a leader, as a parent, is be better at helping them find ways to get closer to it.
Okay.
So what we've found in the research is that when people are in these relationships, and when they talk about their dreams and their vision, not just goals, that it stimulates a part of their brain that helps them to be open to new ideas, to notice things that are going on, and it helps them to be in a place where they're at their cognitive best, their immune system functions better than elsewhere, and they're much more creative and adaptive. And that's what you're after. What you're after is people excited, involved.
So relationships, know their dreams, and then kind of, I don't want to say use their dreams, but I guess you have to kind of reflect on those dreams and
yeah, look, it's not your job. It's not your job to be their deterministic provider.
Right.
You've not become God. So your job, though, is to stay alert to it. If you see an opportunity that comes up, a task force, a new customer that presents an interesting challenge that's related in some way to something that you know wants to work at, you say, hey, Barbara, you want to take this one on? Because what you're doing is, in a sense, matching opportunities or challenges for your company to what people would love to be doing, because then they're going at it with everything.
Gotcha. So you're basically taking the relationship one step further and saying, okay, I've got a good relationship. People know me. They like me. They trust me. Now I really need to understand what drives them, what motivates them, what they see as a successful life.
Yeah, but it has to be in the dream category, because everybody will start off with present. Well, I'd like to make enough money to,
right,
pay down my mortgage or pay off my car. That's not motivating. It turns out that doesn't motivate people at all.
Right.
That's why you have to jump to the dreams. And it turns out that the relationships isn't just liking. We've found that it has a number of specific characteristics to it through this fairly careful research. One of the many articles just got published today, as a matter of fact. One of the characteristics of these really good relationships is that the people involved have a shared sense of purpose or a shared vision. Like we're in it for the same real reasons. And that's something that we now have plenty of data to say the the 25 to 35-year-old millennials are even more sensitive to this than the older generations. I mean, my generation, I was born in 1946. I'm technically a baby boomer, but because my parents are immigrants, I'm more like the pre-boomers. I mean, you put up with all sorts of garbage for 20 years before you expected rewards. That's not the way people are today, anywhere in the world. And the centennials look like they have even more of these characteristics. So, the time is gone in which people thought a good job meant clarity of role and good pay. And actually, we have now data saying that folks that are exploring shorter work weeks to eliminate lunch and eliminate break times and all that are doing the worst thing possible, because it turns out that those are the moments that allow somebody's body and mind to go into what medically is called parasympathetic activation, but in the vernacular, we call it renewal. So in fact, having 15-minute breaks, like coffee breaks where you chat with another person,
right,
or you call home and talk to your partner or spouse or one of your kids, not online. I'm actually talking about face-to-face talking or on the phone. Those end up being really important. And it's more important for people's productivity and innovation that they have the breaks than they get out of work sooner. Because if they get out of work sooner, don't have the breaks, within a matter of weeks, if not months, you're going to be losing a lot of what the person could offer.
Interesting. We have listeners on here. How can they help you? Buy your book? Is that the big thing?
Well, how can they help me? I would say in the last chapter of the book, we talked about asking if people understood our message, if they did some of the exercises. We've got free MOOCs that are out there with 10-minute videos that people can watch and all that. But if you start to gather to get the gist of it, we ask you to have one more 15-minute conversation to bring somebody into this positive attractor space next week. And then the following week, do 2 15 minutes. And if you on a regular basis had 3 of these conversations with somebody at work, somebody at home, or somebody in some professional leisure or community activity or church or temple, 3 more a week, and then they got excited by it and they started to have it, in no time at all, we'll have tens of millions of people spending periodic amounts of time in this psychophysiological state that allows you to bounce back from annoying chronic stress, which is what we have too much of. So the real issue, I think, we could have a world in which people are a lot more excited and innovating in a lot better ways if people did more of this. Now, I think on the way, not only should you buy the book, but if you have 300 close friends, buy one for each of them.
Sure.
Valentine's Day is coming up. It's a good Valentine's Day present. If you're Irish, St. Patrick's Day. If you're Greek Independence Day in March.
Well, and Christmas is coming, so.
Yeah, right. You don't want to wait that long.
Get your shopping done early. Well, Richard, I appreciate your time today. This has been very, very insightful. Very insightful.
Good. I hope you and your listeners get a little bit of a feel that this is intriguing, because it's a little counterintuitive, because everybody immediately goes to the social, what I call the social engineering, fix it. Let me tell you how to do this, and it's more efficient. It may appear more efficient, but it's not more effective for the ways that people's minds and hearts go. So, and then their behavior follows. So we're hoping that a lot more organizations will be a lot more adaptive and innovative, and I think then they'll succeed.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connections. All rights reserved.